I'm Caitlin Dryden, and this is Slut. I'm Caitlin Dryden, and welcome to Slut, the show where I question who is and what makes a slut. It's Valentine's Day today, and I couldn't think of anything more romantic to talk about than polyamory. And before we get into it, if you are just listening to this and you'd like to watch the episode, you can watch it on YouTube. The channel is Slut Podcast, or you can also watch it on Spotify. But let's go back to polyamory. It's been having a cultural moment for quite a while now, but especially over the past 2 months. New York Magazine's cover story in January was a practical guide to polyamory. Time, The Guardian, The New York Times, Vanity Fair, and The New Yorker all had pieces on it in January. And they even talked about it on The View a few weeks ago, and here's what Whoopi Goldberg had to say.
Whoopi, the amazing thing is 1 out of 9 Americans has been in a polyamorous. Were they all in Iowa yesterday?
Yeah.
Right?
They're the hard other way, I think. It must have been.
I don't know about that.
It's those sleepy little towns.
Those sleepy little towns.
Because they're sleepy. They need to sleepy with other people.
You guys have to widen your arena of people that you know. Because it's not just sleepy little towns.
No.
It's more evolved people maybe in big towns.
I've heard things.
Listen, if you can do more than one thing at a time, you can have a polyamorous relationship. Okay? If you can chew gum and walk, you can do more than
So it's
one person.
multitasking.
The whole
Yes,
thing
it
is
is.
skeevy.
Even still, monogamy is the dominant relationship form, but it's not having too great of a time right now. The U.S. divorce rate ranges from 40 to 50%, and an estimated 30 to 60% of married men and 20 to 50% of married women admit to cheating on their partners. And over the past about 50 years, our society has gotten a lot more liberal and accepting, and views have changed. Different types of families are more accepted now. But in our relationship styles, in our dominant relationship styles, we haven't budged too much. People are rewarded for monogamy and given couple privilege. I have personally experienced this. I grew up in the age where it was really common to just hook up with people in university, hookup culture. And I think the dominant relationship form for people in their 20s is situationships. So I didn't have my first serious long-term boyfriend until the past year. And the way I was treated so differently when I finally had a boyfriend was honestly astonishing. People were like, oh, thank God, we finally figured her out. There's nothing wrong with her. Now we know that there's nothing wrong with her because she's had a boyfriend. And it's honestly complete fucking bullshit. And it pisses me off. And non-monogamy isn't new. It's existed for centuries underground, but it wasn't until the sexual revolution in the 1960s that it was brought to the forefront. Studies show that over 20% of people in the U.S. admit to being in a consensually non-monogamous relationship. 4 to 5% of the population say that they're in a polyamorous relationship right now, and that percentage makes up 16 million people. And if you don't know what consensual non-monogamy is, it's the practice of having multiple sexual and/or romantic partners at once, where all people involved are aware and consent to it. Non-monogamy is an umbrella term for polyamory, swinging, open marriage, or open relationship, solo polyamory, and relationship anarchy. People who are non-monogamous follow these principles as laid out in Polysecure by Jessica Fern, which we'll also be talking about later in this conversation. So first of all, they believe that love is not possessive or a finite resource. Second, they believe it's normal to be attracted to more than one person at the same time. And I think that's totally normal. And how could you not? We're all humans. You can't stop that. And third, there are multiple ways to practice love, sexual, and intimate relationships. And fourth, jealousy is not something to be avoided, but something that can be informative and worked through. And while I believe that we should normalize polyamorous relationships, I've noticed that some people, not all, some, convince themselves that they want this type of relationship when they really don't, because of a few reasons. First, it's the more liberal and intellectual thing to do. Second, it's kind of trendy right now. Third, and worst of all, it's all their partner will give them. Dan Savage calls this poly under duress, and it can sometimes work out. And I'm not saying that all non-monogamous relationships are like this. There are plenty of really healthy non-monogamous relationships, just like there are plenty of healthy monogamous relationships. But with that, there are a lot of unhealthy poly and monogamous relationships. And also, I'm not saying that monogamy is the best form of relationship. Please don't misinterpret me. You know, people in monogamous relationships, especially heterosexual non-monogamous relationships, the women often experience more intimate partner violence, femicide, emotional and verbal abuse. This is really dominant in monogamous relationships. But I'm concerned about people who convince themselves that they want polyamorous relationships when they really don't. Personally, having multiple partners at once sounds like a nightmare for me, but swinging sounds much more appealing, especially if you're with somebody for a really long time and you want to spark things up in the bedroom again. Or I could see myself being with somebody and they have a specific kink and, you know, I'm not willing to do it. I don't know what that would be, but they go outside the relationship to get that kink fulfilled. And, you know, I would do that if this is the person that I love and I know that is the right person for me. I could see myself understanding that. But yeah, having like 3 different boyfriends, oh my God, no. No, thank you. That sounds like a lot of emotional labor, honestly. And a question that I've been asking myself is, what are we searching for in polyamorous relationships? And I wonder, do open relationships create an illusion of freedom? Esther Perel says that freedom and sexuality are linked. And so I think when we are searching for something in ourselves, we can often turn to our sexuality to search for that. And if we are feeling stuck and we feel limited, we could turn to our sexuality and opening up our relationship to get that fulfilled. And with all this newfound coverage of polyamory, I stumbled upon this piece from The Atlantic called Polyamory, the ruling class's latest fad by Tyler Austin Harper. And Harper's issue with the new open marriage discourse is not ethical, but political. And I'm just going to read you this excerpt from the article because I think he just says it so eloquently. There is something obtuse about the recent polyamory coverage disproportionately focused as it is on trendsetters. The very class of Americans who reap the benefits of marriage are in the same class who get to declare monogamy passé and boring. The rich, who marry within their social class to combine their wealth, enjoy the advantages of the double income, 2-parent household, and then grow tired of these very luxuries. From their gilded pedestals, they declare polyamory superior to monogamy. Media reports rarely note these tensions or explain that this brand of free love requires disposable income and time to pay babysitters and pencil in their panoply of paramours that are foreclosed to the laboring masses. Then he points after this part to an article that got little coverage written by disability rights activist Jillian Wise, wrote in 2022 for New York Magazine, exploring the freedom polyamory provides her as a disabled person. But the focus of Harper's article is around the latest in poly, quote-unquote, feminist discourse, Molly Roden Winter's novel More, a memoir of open marriage. And after reading his piece, I knew that I had to read her book. Throughout the whole book, I'm going to be so honest, I felt nauseous and sick to my stomach. I not at what was being described, because it is graphic, but that didn't bother me. What bothered me was what Molly was doing and allowing in her relationship and relationships. Their open marriage begins after one night Molly leaves the house, disgruntled with the domestic duties, and runs into a friend of hers who invites her to have a drink. At the bar, she meets this young guy, and this guy, might I add, has a girlfriend. They flirt, and there's some sort of connection between them, and they end up exchanging numbers. When she gets home that night, she tells her husband, Stuart, remember that name because we are going to be talking about him a lot coming up, and Stuart encourages her to sleep with him because it turns him on. But Molly doesn't really want to do this. And with that, their open marriage begins. So she begins sleeping with this guy, the guy who has a girlfriend. I'm just going to clarify that. The guy who has a girlfriend. She sleeps with him about a handful of times throughout the next 4 years. And as soon as the open marriage happens, Stuart rekindles things with an ex, which is a little suspicious. I guess she just miraculously got out of this divorce as soon as, or miraculously she got divorced as soon as they opened their marriage. And Stuart tells Molly about him seeing this ex, and Molly gets jealous, obviously. I would get jealous too, even if, it's a new open marriage and you're only hooking up with this random guy who has a girlfriend, and then your husband rekindles stuff with an ex, like that would really hurt me. And anyway, so she gets jealous. And Stuart decides in that moment that going forward, Molly is to tell him everything because it turns him on. Tell him everything that she does with this other guy. But he is not going to tell Molly anything. And this happens for 4 years. Molly lets this happen for years. It's crazy. And she, like I said, she only sleeps with this one guy a handful of times in the next 4 years. But I want to talk about the last time that they slept together. So they have sex, and she goes upstairs to text Stu. Like, hey, baby, miss you. I just had sex with him, but don't worry. Don't worry. He is not a great lover. He's not good. So, love you. I'll talk to you soon. But she ends up sending that text to the guy downstairs. So obviously he left as soon as she walked downstairs, and good for him. I mean, I guess that's a bit of karma for cheating on his girlfriend. But after that night, she asks Stuart to close the relationship, and he refuses. And for the next few years, Molly has a string of men who she sleeps with from Ashley Madison. And these guys are all cheating on their girlfriends and wives with her. And they all treat her so disrespectfully. And I think this is the part of the problem here is, from what I understand, Molly was in a relationship for 4 years, and then she met Stuart right after. So she never had a period of time where she was single and she was able to explore and have fun. So when they open up their marriage, she's never really been single before and has never had those foundational experiences where you learn as a woman, as a young, heterosexual woman, how men will treat you when you are having sex with them and, having these dating experiences. And this is something I'll talk about a bit more in a bit. But what I want to talk about is this one relationship she has with this guy who she's having sex with, and he repeatedly stealths her. And if you don't know what stealthing is when somebody unconsensually removes the condom during intercourse. It is considered rape because you're not consenting to the condom being removed. And so he does this to her multiple times. And she gets a few UTIs because this guy is taking the condom off and not telling her. And I just want to read a quote of how she describes being stealthed one day. Sex is consensual that day, but it is also rough. Rougher than it's ever been before. And rougher than I want it to be. I give myself over to his desires and try to squelch my own. And when she tells Stuart, her husband, that she's getting these UTIs because this guy has raped her, this is what Stuart says. He's breaking all of my toys. I'm not even kidding. This is what I'm laughing or else I'll start crying. All right. I'm not in any of this when I'm laughing and it's serious. It's just because I'm trying to get through this without shedding a tear. And, yeah. But let's get to know Stuart a little bit more. So to get to know him, I'm going to read an excerpt about Stuart from the book. I've always believed that and this is Molly talking. I've always believed that I needed a man who was in control. With Stu, I barely have to think, and most of the time, I enjoy the submissive role. Stuart especially knows how I like to be held down, never to the point of pain, but with enough pressure, I can orgasm fully. Can empty myself out again and again and again. Stu has explained to me more than once that to stay hard for an hour, sometimes longer, he must conjure the self-restraint of a machine. This sometimes leads to the vocal explosion of pent-up energy, often in the form of words like cunt and whore. When I complain, it takes him out of the moment. Over time, we've arrived at a compromise less than satisfactory for the both of us. He will try his best not to scream cunt during sex, and I will do my best to ignore him if he does. This is really sad. My heart breaks for this woman. So Stuart is the sole provider of the family, and I believe that he works in music, he does scoring, and he always comes home late and never does any of the domestic duties or does anything domestic with her. And, I guess I could understand it from the man's perspective of I'm going out and I'm making all this money and you have to do the domestic duties because you're at home and I'm providing for you. But it's yes, that's true. And I'm sure she does, but he always comes home late and he's not present. He's not in the relationship. And that's just not fair. To go back to what I was talking about before about how Molly didn't have the experience of being single for a good period of time and exploring and learning about herself and having that freedom, that I think this really hampers her self-evolution and her sexual evolution. And when they open up the relationship, she almost reverts to being like an 18 to 22-year-old. And she was making the mistakes I was making at 18 to 22 when she's in her 30s and 40s with kids. And, I don't want to say that you can never grow and, make a change and experience these things, but these are experiences that suck. They're not fun to go through. You have to go through them to learn, how to tell men how to treat you properly or what to expect of men. And she is just allowing all this shit to happen. And sometimes when we're a slut, it's because we don't like ourselves. And we put up with the disrespect and the mistreatment of others because we believe that's what we're worth. And, that is something that I learned when I was younger. She had to learn this in her 30s, not because she wanted to, but because she was forced to by her husband to go outside of the marriage and explore. And she kept on having these relationships and is going to have to continue having extramarital relationships for the rest of her life to compete with Stu, because Stu is always going to be with somebody else. And to talk about casual sex a bit more, in heterosexual relationships, women have more to risk with casual sex, and I think that's why we desire it less than men. We risk male violence, rape, and of course, men and women both have the same vulnerabilities in terms of sexual health, but women just have more at stake when it comes to our sexual health than men do. And Something I learned is that women who convince themselves that they desire casual sex, but they don't actually want it, experience more disrespect from their partners because they're not coming at it from an empowered lens and they don't know how to stand up for themselves. And men can sniff this out. Like, they know. And therefore, they mistreat you more. And I'm speaking from experience here. I'm not coming at this with no experience. I know this firsthand. And I really wish it wasn't that way, but it still is. You know, maybe in the next another 150 years, it won't be like this. But in 2024, this still remains true. But let's get back to the book. After a string of men from Ashley Madison, she begs Stu to close the relationship. But again, he refuses. And she gives him an ultimatum. If the relationship is to continue and to remain open, they have to go to therapy. And here I'm kind of confused of what the ultimatum was. Was she going to leave him if they didn't go to therapy? Because Stuart was never closing the relationship. That is something that we learn as readers. As they go to therapy, here's when we begin to learn that her parents also had an open relationship, and it was her father's idea to do this because her mother never experienced her sexuality outside of their relationship. And when her parents' relationship opens, her mother meets this guy who she affectionately calls Jesus Christ, and he gets her wrapped up in a literal cult. And then she meets this other guy, and he's like the cult leader or something. He's also in the cult. She calls him Buddha. So she's calling these men Jesus and Buddha. And she gets wrapped up into the cult. And then Molly, her daughter, she wraps Molly up into the cult. So Molly had to leave this cult at some point. I want to read to you probably the only true self-reflective moment in the book. And it's this passage right here. And it's in her therapist's office, and she's talking about her mother. Well, it makes me question if my mother ever did anything for herself, I say. I mean, seeing other men was my father's idea, and then this whole spiritual quest of hers was driven by the men she was involved with. Even her names for them, Jesus and Buddha, like they are divine beings or something. Like the men have all the answers, and she's just following them, like a disciple. Mitchell, her therapist, nods encouragingly as he scribbles notes. So I'm wondering if that's the source of the repressed rage she told me about. I pause. Mitchell stops writing and looks at me waiting. It freaks me out a little. I thought her sexual freedom was the only release valve she had. But what if it was just, I don't know, an illusion of freedom? My tears are rising again. And I'm guessing, says Mitchell, that you're worried about the same thing? That open marriage is giving you an illusion of freedom too? I nod, reaching for the tissues. And then she never revisits that. Like, what? So I'm revisiting it here today. And that is why I titled this episode, Do Open Relationships Give Us an Illusion of Freedom? And instead of thinking about this more, Molly forces herself, I'm not even kidding, forces herself to have a threesome that she doesn't want to have. And I wonder, did she do that to prove to her husband that she was free? So now we're getting towards the end of this book, and her husband has a long-term girlfriend. The girlfriend is named Kiwi, and Molly also has a long-term boyfriend, and his name is Scott. And here is where she's talking about Kiwi and Stuart's relationship and thinking about her and Scott's. I know about this dramatic thread between the two of them, Kiwi and her husband. Kiwi has reached a point of accepting her husband's other relationships, and she's on board with my primacy as Stuart's wife. But the fact that Stu continues to date other women is a thorn in her side. I understand her feeling this way, and I've told Stuart as much. If Scott wanted to date other women, that's her boyfriend, it would probably bother me too. I like being the new shiny one. But at the same time, I'm relieved that Stuart isn't capitulating to Kiwi's jealousy. After all, he never capitulated to mine. And I don't know if it was capitulating to jealousy as much as it was to maybe care for your wife when she was going through a really difficult period with the open relationship and maybe giving her some space to get comfortable. And, you know, this guy just wants to have his cake and eat it too, straight up. He just wants to fuck all these bitches, okay? And I'm going to now read another passage. And this is when Stu goes on his first trip away with Kiwi, and he gets back. And here is him talking about it. We didn't go hiking. It was too rainy, he says. Stu. We went outlet shopping, and I bought some shoes. And then we went bowling. He continues on, his voice animated. Their weekend was very domestic, he tells me. Kiwi had her period, and everything in the Airbnb was white, making sex more cautious than passionate. Then Stu spilled guacamole on the couch, and they had to spend 40 minutes trying to get the spot out. He describes these events as negatives, but this type of at-home, in-it-together scenario is what I've always craved from him. I've come to think of the domestic tasks as something I do separately from my husband. Something that Stuart avoids at all costs. By the time Stuart gets to the part about making dinner with Kiwi and that he peeled the potatoes, I'm in tears. Like I said, if I don't laugh, I'll cry. You know, that bums me out. This is like actually towards the end of the book. So this is like something that's, you know, not entirely far out from their relationship. But how sad that your husband won't do anything like that with you? What? And you're allowing that? And here's where I'm going to return to Tyler Austin Harper's article, the one we were talking about before. And I'm just going to quote him because he says it so eloquently. The only solution Molly can imagine is to persist in an open marriage rather than push for one that's equal. Inward sexual revolution plainly feels more possible than a revolution in who does the dishes. And I mean, that's a mic drop, honestly. What a great line. What a great line. So at the end of the book, Molly's big reflectionary moment is when she realizes that all of these experiences make her grow. Yeah, that's what happens. You go through shit and you grow and you experience stuff. Yes, yeah, you're right. That's exactly what happens, Molly. And she makes sure to tell us a lot about how much she loves her open relationship now. And she even wrote another article. So she wrote this book and then she wrote an article for Time in January called Why I Love My Open Marriage. The lady doth protest too much, methinks. And even Stuart knows that he comes across as an asshole in this because he says in the New York Times book review, quote, Stuart is enthusiastic about the memoir, but worries that people will think he manipulated his wife into opening their marriage. Quote, this is exactly from Stuart. All of my reservations, to be perfectly honest, are because I'm being selfish, wondering, how is this going to make me look? And Stuart, if you're listening, it makes you look bad. You look like an asshole. And yes, it does seem like you manipulated your wife into an open marriage. And I often think of toxic relationships as a cult of two. And it's interesting that her mother was literally in a cult and Molly was also in this cult. And now she's in this new cult with her husband, Stuart, and they are trying to bring people into their culty, toxic relationship and make them stay so that they are able to persist in this marriage. If they did not have multiple other partners, they wouldn't be able to last together. And this is where I am concerned about open relationships. I think that sometimes people open up their relationship to stay together when the relationship needs to end. Everybody needs to go. You don't need to stay. And the dynamic between Molly and Stuart reminded me of Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre's relationship. And I was exempted from French people. Okay, I am so bad at pronouncing French stuff. So I definitely butchered those names. I know who they are. All right, I get it. And I'm just going to call them Simone and Jean-Paul. All right, I'm not going to do the last names going forward. But if you don't know, Simone is a feminist philosopher who most notably wrote The Second Sex, and her husband, Jean-Paul, was a philosopher and playwright. And they opened up their marriage back in 1929, and it stayed open until he died in 1980. Simone released The Woman Destroyed in 1967, and the book is broken down into 3 sections about 3 different women. And the last section particularly is what I want to talk about. And that is named after the title, The Woman Destroyed. So he does have an affair with this woman. He tells her, and then she also has affairs with other men. But she's an older woman and he is also older, but he's now with this woman who's 38. And she isn't getting any attention from her husband anymore. And she doesn't want to look outside of their relationship. She does go to a long-term partner who she used to have just because she's trying to make herself feel better about this situation. But I also just wanted to read a passage from The Woman Destroyed about their relationship. And The Woman Destroyed is fictional, all right? It is fictional. We'll go back to that in a moment. So here it is. Our sexual life? I don't know exactly when it lost its warmth. Which of us wearied first? At one time, I was vexed by his indifference. That was what caused my little affair with Quaylen. But might not he have been disappointed by my coldness? That is of secondary importance, it seems to me. It would explain his going to bed with other women, but not his breaking away from me, nor losing his head over Noelle, her husband's new girlfriend. Why her? If she were at least genuinely beautiful, really young, and outstandingly intelligent, I should understand it. I should suffer, but I should understand. She is 38. She is fairly pleasant to look at. No more. She is very superficial. So why? So why, I said to Marie Lambert, I am certain I am worth more than she is. She smiled. That is not where the question lies. Where did it lie? Apart from the novelty and a pleasant body, what could Noelle give Maurice that I do not give him? She said, other people's loves are never comprehensible. But I am convinced of something that I cannot find adequate words for. With me, Maurice has a relationship in depth, one to which his essential being is committed and which is, therefore, indestructible. He is only attached to Noelle by his most superficial feelings. Each of them might just as well be in love with someone else. Maurice and I are not wholly conjoined. The flaw is that my relationship with Maurice is not indestructible, since he is destroying it. And while the book may be fictional, Simone does seem to know about a woman who has a hard time reconciling her husband's affairs. And Simone and Jean-Paul claim their marriage was all about equality, and they actually lived in separate residences, but it was him who engaged in countless affairs, and she only responded with a few long-term affairs. And he was going outside of their relationship until he died. And this is what kind of bummed me out a bit, because I just can't tell, and we'll never know if her relationship made her truly happy. But she said that whatever her many books and literary prizes, whatever her role in the women's movement, her greatest achievement in life was her relationship with Jean-Paul. And that can be read as beautiful. I had that first thought of, that's really beautiful, but then fucking bummed me out, honestly, because it's like this woman who I have been taught in a feminist education. I took women and gender studies in college, and, you know, you're taught to look up to these women, these feminist philosophers, and then to read that she was never able to put her foot down for in this way and get what she really wanted out of the relationship. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if she wanted complete monogamy, but I do feel like she wanted monogamy at parts of the life, at parts in her life, and she never got that. And so I haven't reconciled this, honestly. I don't know what the answer is here, and I don't think we'll ever really know, but it's just something that bummed me out. And this conversation that we're having right now is, I think, mainly on open heterosexual relationships. I do think that queer polyamorous relationships are different. And I guess where my concern lies in heterosexual open relationships is that for it to work, and I mean the same thing in queer, but for it to really work, both partners have to really want it. And I almost feel like, maybe this is controversial, that in heterosexual situations, opening it up should almost be the woman's idea, because I think women people please a lot, and they will go along with things because that's how we've been raised, and they will accept things for less. And, you know, I guess, of course, men could do that as well, but I do think it's more common amongst women. And also, our brains are just wired differently. So when you open it up and it's the man's idea, he's just going to go out and fuck as many people as he can fuck. But when it's the woman's idea, I think that it's done in a different way. And also, Molly was researching how to have a proper open relationship. She was reading The Ethical Slut. I mean, I don't know if Stu did this. I am going to say he probably didn't, just judging based off his character. He didn't read The Ethical Slut. And he was not engaging with her in that way of learning about these relationships. He did go to therapy with her. That's true. And, you know, I won't say that Molly wasn't without some kind of grave mistakes and hurting Stu sometimes in the relationship. But on the whole, Stu did a lot worse things, so many worse things compared to Molly. So let's move on from this section. And I want to go back to this article from the New York Times in 2016 that they wrote about Monique and her husband, Sidney Hicks' open relationship. And they quoted Helen Fisher, a biological anthropologist at the Kinsey Institute. And here's what Helen Fisher had to say about open relationships. People have had open marriages forever because a lot of us would prefer to have more than one relationship, but they never end up working in the long term. She claims, and this is going back to the journalist now, that the reason that open marriages don't work are biological. The parts of the brain involved in romantic love are next to the areas that help orchestrate thirst and hunger, she said. Quote, thirst and hunger aren't going to change anytime soon, and neither is the pair bonding instinct that we recognize as romantic love. Dan Savage was very quick to dispel Fisher's remarks, saying that she had nothing to back up the idea that everybody in open marriages are miserable. And I agree. You know, that's a huge blanket statement. You just can't say that. But he also called her theory of brain adjacency complete bullshit. And while I'm not sure about brain adjacency, I that seems a little off to me. I do agree. Jessica Fern, who wrote Polysecure, which I was talking about at the beginning of this conversation, backs up what Fisher is getting at here. But instead of linking it to whatever Fisher was linking it to, Fern backs it up to attachment theory. And now I'm going to read a part. I'm going to read a section from Polysecure, which talks about this. So if you do have this book or you want to get this book and you want to know where this is page 143 to 144. Consensual non-monogamy can activate the attachment system into primal panic. From the perspective of attachment theory, we need to be connected to people to survive. So our nervous system equates emotional connection with safety and emotional disconnection with danger or threat. So this is what's been happening in Molly's relationship. Attachment-related threats include the loss of our potential attachment figure, separation from our attachment figure, or loss of access to them for periods of times longer than we're used to. These threats don't have to be actual to activate the attachment system. Even theoretical or symbolic threats can initiate attachment distress, and this is called primal panic. As Sue Johnson states, separation distress arises when an attachment bond is threatened or a secure connection is lost. There are other kinds of emotional bonds based on shared activities or respect, and when they are broken, a person may be distressed. But that distress does not have the same intensity or significance when an attachment bond is called into question. Emotional and physical isolation from attachment figures is inherently traumatizing for human beings, beginning with it as a heightened sense, not simply vulnerability and danger, but also helplessness. This is now going back to Jessica. Many of my clients report being highly anxious and off their emotional axis for hours, sometimes even days, before their partner goes on a date with somebody else. Others seriously spiral out while the date is happening. Cognitively, they know that their partner is still alive, not abandoning them or doing anything wrong, but their body and emotions are in primal panic. In such cases, jealousy is not a sufficient or accurate description of what is happening for the partner in distress. When primal attachment panic gets mislabeled as jealousy, the partner experiencing it can be left thinking that there is something wrong with them, that this is their issue to figure out on their own, and that they should be better at doing consensual non-monogamy. They might use self-destructive behaviors such as distractions or substances in an attempt to feel better. But the root of the problem is left unaddressed. This can also escalate into panic attacks, meltdowns, or an emotional crisis that can pit partners against each other or become extremely difficult for everyone involved to manage. However, when people are able to identify this experience as primal panic, understand how it is rooted in their attachment needs, learn how to better self-soothe, and address these attachment needs with their partner, a new path forward opens up. And totally, I think that, if polyamory is what both partners really want, you can work through these things. But it does instill this primal panic in us. I totally get that. And, we've all kind of felt that panic before when the relationship is going to end, or you can feel them slipping away, or something has changed. We feel this in monogamy all the time, too. And I don't think that monogamy is for everyone. But I also don't think polyamory is for everyone. And as I said before, there are many toxic monogamous relationships. I mean, probably maybe more, just because there are more monogamous relationships in our society. So there are more toxic monogamous relationships. But there are plenty of really toxic polyamorous relationships. And as Fern points out throughout this whole book, you have to have a secure attachment with yourself and with your partners to achieve success in polyamory. And I think that if you do want to be in a polyamorous relationship, this is a really great book to read. And she also just released, or is about to release, a second book that goes deeper into being polysecure and all these things. So those are things that you need to be researching and looking at. But here I go again, Stuart wasn't really researching in the same way Molly was about these things and teaching himself. And also, all of this stuff and to have a secure attachment requires time and money. And that is stuff that a lot of people don't have access to. And I fear that in this age of polyamory, that instead of leaving a relationship that no longer works or no longer serves us, one that is toxic and abusive, or simply just asking your partner to take on their fair share of the domestic duties, women will succumb to and I'm talking about mainly women here, you know, women will succumb to having an open relationship because it's the only freedom and equality that they can get in their relationship. Let's go back to something I was talking about at the beginning of the conversation. Esther Perel says that freedom and sexuality are linked. Freedom is sexy, desire is sexy, adventure is sexy. The dishes, maintenance sex, and laundry are not sexy. But you know what's also not sexy? Is crying on the bathroom floor for hours while your husband is on a date with some woman that he met from Tinder. No matter what relationship style works for you, I think Molly's story serves as a cautionary tale. Open marriage can give you an illusion of freedom, especially when that marriage is not equal. And I also think a part of the cautionary tale is that you need to have a period of your life where you are free to explore and be single. And that's something that Molly never had. And as a result, she had to go through all of this just shitty stuff later in life when you honestly want to go through that at 18 to 22 and say, all right, I don't need to do that again. I learned going forward, not going to do that. And I think the takeaway from all of this is to know yourself really well. And, you know, I think that's also a privilege to get to explore and get to know yourself. But it's also, what are you willing to put up with in your relationships? And you need to figure out what you want to put up with. And then when you are not getting that from your partner and you're being mistreated, you need to have the balls to go. You need to know when to leave that relationship. And, you know, I'm 27. I don't have the experience of being with somebody for 30 years. So, you know, I would love to have this conversation again when, you know, I'm at a different stage of my life and have a new perspective on it. But this is how I feel in this moment. And I do wonder, what do you think? What is your experience with open relationships? Did you feel a sense of freedom? Were you looking for freedom? What are you trying to find in your open relationships? And I would love to hear from you, so you can write me at sletpodcast@gmail.com. That's sletpodcast@gmail.com. And if you write me, I will read it on the next show. And that concludes the second Slut Solo episode. So if you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to share it with a friend, share it on your social media, talk about it with people, have these conversations, write me, comment, like my posts, do all those things. And also make sure you're following @Slut Podcast on Instagram and @SlutPod on TikTok. So thank you so much for listening to this conversation today. I hope that you got something from it. It was honestly not an easy episode for me. It took a lot out of me, and I'm so happy that I did it, though. But it taught me a lot, and I'm just excited to share it and talk about it with you guys. So thank you so much. I will talk to you soon, sluts.